The cartwheel struck a hidden fissure in the road, sending a jolt through the frame that rattled Dr. George Bagster Phillips awake from a shallow doze. His fingers tightened instinctively around the splintered rim of the cab bench, knuckles bleaching white against the grime of worn leather as the vehicle shuddered to a halt. Outside, the horse snorted a cloud of steam that dissolved instantly into the grey pre-dawn, leaving only the low, wet drip of condensation falling from the gas lamp above to mark time on the cobblestones with a rhythm too slow for panic. "Here, doctor." The driver's voice cracked, thin and eager to be gone, though he did not turn his head, staring fixedly at the reins as if the leather held some secret map to safety. "Bucks Row," Phillips said, pushing the door open before the man could descend to assist. "Stay with the horse." He stepped down onto a pavement that felt slick, a film of oil and river mist coating the soles of his boots while Whitecapel slept, or perhaps merely pretended to. Behind the brickwork of the nearby warehouses, the silence was not empty but heavy, pressing against the eardrums like deep water until a single shutter clattered somewhere 3 streets over, a sharp wooden gunshot that made Phillips flinch before he masked the movement by adjusting his coat collar. He walked towards the archway where the gaslight was dying, the mantle sputtering a sickly yellow that failed to penetrate the throat of the passage, forcing him to slow as his hand drifted to the pocket where his notebook rested, edges already soft from use. He did not need light to know what waited, for the smell arrived first. It was not the usual stench of the East End, that sour mash of gin, rotting cabbage, and unwashed bodies which clung to the district like a second skin, but something different, metallic and sharp, cutting through the damp air with the clarity of a bell, undeniable and fresh. "Doctor!" Inspector Spratling emerged from the gloom, his face a pale oval in the half-light, looking exhausted with shadows under his eyes bruised and deep, his uniform coat buttoned wrong at the collar. He held a lantern low, the flame trembling slightly in his grip as he gestured with it towards the left side of the fence, the light swinging wildly before he steadied it. "Found her 20 minutes past," Spratling said, his voice dropping as he swallowed hard. "John Nielsen, the carman, said he thought she was asleep until he saw the blood." Phillips nodded, a single sharp dip of the chin, and moved past the inspector, his footsteps silent on the damp ground as the archway narrowed, brick walls closing in until the air felt stagnant, trapped between the high fences of the timber yard and the back of the warehouse. There she lay on her back, the position wrong, neither the sprawl of a drunkard collapsed in stupor nor the curled fetal tuck of someone seeking warmth against the chill, but arranged with a terrible, deliberate symmetry, hands resting near her sides, legs extended straight. The skirt was hiked up slightly around the knees, exposing the boots, yet she looked merely resting except for the throat. Phillips knelt, ignoring how the dampness of the ground seeped through his trousers immediately, a cold bite against his skin, and leaned closer until the smell of iron intensified, coating the back of his throat with the taste of old pennies. 2 cuts ran horizontally across the neck, superficial at first glance, but beneath them the flesh gaped open, a jagged red mouth that had swallowed the life right out of her, while blood pooled beneath her head in a dark, viscous lake that had not yet begun to congeal, reflecting the dim flicker of the lantern Spratling held aloft. "She made no sound," Phillips asked, not looking up as his eyes traced the line of the wound, measuring the angle, the depth, the trajectory. "Not a scream, Doctor," Spratling whispered, shifting his weight until the leather of his boots creaked. "Nielsen heard nothing, neither did the neighbors. Windows are open half an inch, most of them. It's August, hot nights." Phillips reached out, his gloved finger hovering over the wound before touching the edge of the severed skin, finding it cold, the body already cooling, the stiffness of death beginning to claim the jaw, though the limbs remained pliable. He pressed gently against the carotid area where the artery was gone, cut clean through. "To do this requires pressure," Phillips murmured, more to himself than the inspector, "significant force and time." "Time," Spratling's voice tightened, "in the middle of a street." "In the middle of a street that sleeps," Phillips corrected, shifting his gaze to the ground around the body where the cobblestones were stained, a dark Rorschach blot spreading outward from the head, Yet there was no spray, no arterial fan painted across the brickwork of the fence, no splatter on the nearby gate, for the blood had flowed downward, gravity doing its work after the heart had stopped pumping. She was killed elsewhere, Phillips said, the words hanging in the air heavier than the fog, or she was killed here, but held down firmly so she could not struggle, so she could not cry out. He looked at the woman's face, pale with eyes half open, staring at nothing, pupils fixed and dilated, showing no terror frozen in the features, only a blank, vacant surprise. He did not know her name yet, not truly, though he knew the type, destitute, forgotten, one of the thousands who drifted through the casual wards and slept in doss houses when they had a few pence, and on the streets when they did not. "Who is she?" Phillips asked. "Unknown, no purse, no identification," Sprattling replied, clearing his throat, the sound harsh in the stillness. "We are checking the lodging houses, might be one of the common women from Thrall Street." Phillips stood up, his knees cracking with a dry snap that echoed briefly before the fog swallowed the sound. The gas jet hissed, a serpent of blue flame fighting the yellow gloom that clung to the tiled walls of the mortuary. Phillips washed his hands in the zinc basin, the water turning pink then red as it spiraled down the drain, carrying with it the slick residue of Buck's Row. He did not dry them immediately. The dampness on his skin felt necessary, a tactile reminder that the street outside was real, that the woman on the slab was real, and that the blood coating his gloves was not some theatrical prop, but the vital fluid of a life extinguished with brutal efficiency. He turned to the table. Mary Ann Nichols lay under the sheet, a shapeless mound save for the feet protruding at the end, boots still caked with the mud of the East End. "Ready the instruments, Thomas," Phillips said, his voice flat, stripped of the fatigue that threatened to buckle his knees. The assistant, a boy of 19 with eyes too wide for his skull, nodded once and stepped forward, the metal trays clattering as he arranged the scalpels, the saw, the probes. The sound echoed off the high ceiling, sharp and indifferent. Phillips pulled the sheet down to the waist. The air in the room grew heavier, thick with the copper tang of dried blood and the sweet, cloying scent of beginning decay that always arrived sooner than one expected in this heat. He began with the neck. The external examination at the scene had revealed the horror, but here, under the steady, unflickering gaslight, the anatomy spoke with a clarity that the fog had obscured. 2 distinct incisions ran across the throat, the upper one, superficial, nicking the skin and the underlying muscle, the lower one, deeper, far more destructive. "Note the position," Phillips murmured, leaning in until his breath fogged the pale flesh, observing how it ran transverse, left to right. He inserted the probe into the lower wound, the steel sliding effortlessly through the severed tissues. It passed beneath the jawline, cutting across the windpipe, slicing through the carotid arteries with a precision that suggested a hand steady as a surgeon's and a blade sharp as a razor. "The depth is considerable," Phillips said, watching the probe disappear. "It has severed the left common carotid artery and the internal jugular vein. The windpipe is divided completely." Thomas scratched the nib of his pen against the paper, the scratch, 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 a rhythmic counterpoint to the silence of the dead woman. "And the force?" Thomas asked, not looking up, his voice thin. "Significant," Phillips replied. "To cut through the vertebrae would require immense strength, but this is soft tissue, yet the clean nature of the cut implies a single sweeping motion, no hesitation." He moved the probe away and wiped the blade on a rag that was already stiff with previous stains. Now came the part that would keep him awake when the lamps were finally extinguished. He placed his hands on the abdomen. The skin was pale, waxy, stretched tight over the distended belly. At the scene, the skirt had been hiked up, revealing the boots, but the abdomen itself had appeared intact, covered by the chemise and the jacket. Here, with the clothing removed, the true intent of the killer lay exposed. A jagged laceration ran down the center of the abdomen, starting just below the sternum and extending to the pubic region. It was not a clean cut like the throat. This was messy, hurried, yet deliberate in its exploration. "Jesus," Thomas whispered, the pen stopping mid-stroke. "Right," Phillips commanded, his tone sharpening. "Do not preach." He took the scalpel and extended the incision slightly, just enough to expose the cavity without disturbing the organs further than they already had been. The peritoneum was laid open. The intestines glistened in the gaslight, coiled and dark, pushed slightly to the left side of the cavity. "The abdominal wall has been ripped open," Phillips dictated, his eyes tracing the ragged edges of the wound where the flesh had been torn rather than sliced. "The incision extends from the xiphoid process to the pubis. The peritoneum is exposed." He reached in, his gloved fingers gentle despite the gore, and shifted a loop of the small intestine. It slid under his touch, slippery and warm, still holding the memory of life. There was no major hemorrhage within the cavity itself. The blood had mostly escaped externally or pooled beneath the body before the stiffness of death had set in. "No penetration of the organs," Phillips noted, squinting against the glare of the gas mantle. "The liver is intact. The spleen is untouched. The stomach is distended but unperforated." He paused, his hand hovering over the dark mass of the bowels. The killer had opened her up. Why? To search for something? To practice? The question sat in his throat like a stone, heavy and unswallowable. In his 20 years of practice in the slums and the workhouses, he had seen violence born of rage, of drunken brawls, of jealous lovers. This was different. This was clinical. It mirrored his own trade, but lacked the purpose of healing or even the mercy of a quick end. "The intestines are drawn slightly to the left," Phillips said, forcing his voice to remain steady, to act as a bridge between the horror on the table and the record on the page. "There is no evidence of removal of any organ at this stage, though the cavity has been thoroughly explored." Thomas's hand shook as he wrote, the ink blotting slightly on the E of explored. Is it a surgical hand, Doctor?" Thomas asked, the question slipping out before he could cage it. The way the abdomen was opened. Phillips straightened up, peeling off the blood-soaked gloves. They came away with a wet sucking sound, leaving his hands stained red at the cuticles. He dropped them into the bucket of carbolic solution, watching them sink. "Do not record speculation, Thomas," Phillips said, turning to the basin to wash again, scrubbing his nails with the brush until the skin was raw. "Record only what is before you. The wound is extensive. The intent was to expose the contents of the abdomen. Whether the hand was skilled or merely lucky is a matter for the police, not for this report." "But the precision," Thomas pressed, emboldened by the silence that followed the doctor's washing. "Surely a layman could note her." "A layman with a sharp knife and a hatred for women can do many things," Phillips interrupted, his back still to the boy. "Desperation lends a steadiness to the hand that rivals the trained surgeon. Do not mistake brutality for skill." He dried his hands on a fresh towel, the rough fabric scraping against his raw skin. The smell of the carbolic acid fought a losing battle against the iron scent of the blood, the two odors mixing into a nauseating cocktail that clung to the back of the throat. He turned back to the table. Mary Ann Nichols stared at the ceiling, her eyes half open, the pupils fixed on a point beyond the gas jets, beyond the mortuary walls, beyond the reach of any justice Phillips could administer with a scalpel. Her face was peaceful, almost serene, a stark contrast to the violation of her body. It was a trick of the muscles, he knew, the relaxation of death, but it felt like an accusation. He reached for the sheet. "Cover her," Phillips said softly. Thomas moved quickly, eager to hide the ruin of the abdomen, to restore the dignity of the form, if not the life. The white cotton fell over the pale flesh, concealing the jagged tear, the exposed bowels, the terrible symmetry of the violence. Phillips walked to the window, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. Outside, the fog had thickened, swallowing the street lamps until they were mere halos of diffused light, ghostly orbs floating in the grey soup. Somewhere out there, the man who had done this was walking. He might be buying a pint of ale. He might be sleeping. He might be watching the mortuary from the shadows, waiting to see what the doctor would find. The silence in the room was absolute, a heavy blanket that smothered the sound of Thomas's pen scratching the final lines of the post-mortem notes. Then, from the direction of the police station next door, a sound pierced the quiet. The telegraph machine began to clatter. It was a frantic staccato rhythm, sharp and insistent, the keys striking the metal with the urgency of a heartbeat racing out of control. Click-clack, click-clack. The sound grew louder, as if the machine itself was screaming the news to the world, transmitting the details of Mary Ann's broken body to the newspaper offices in Fleet Street, to the editors hungry for sensation, to the public who would soon demand blood. Phillips flinched, his hand tightening on the windowsill until his knuckles turned white. The narrative was leaving the room. The facts were already being twisted into fiction, the dead woman becoming a headline before the ink on his report was dry. He turned away from the window, the clattering of the telegraph echoing in his skull like a second, malignant pulse. "Finish the notes, Thomas," Phillips said, his voice low, hard as flint, "and lock the door." The telegraph's clatter died, strangled by the heavy oak door, but the vibration lingered in the floorboards, a phantom tremor shaking the dust from the shelves. "Doctor!" Spratling stood in the doorway, his bowler hat crushed in hands that refused to let go of the brim. Rainwater dripped from the rim onto the flagstones, forming a dark, expanding puddle that crept towards Phillips's boots. "They have found another," Spratling said, the words tumbling out before he could draw breath. "Burner Street, Dutfield's Yard, a woman with her throat cut." Phillips did not move. He looked at the covered form of Mary Ann Nichols, the white sheet rising and falling slightly with the draft from the window, a deceptive mimicry of breathing. "When?" 10 minutes past 1. The constable says the blood is still warm. Spratling shifted his weight, the leather of his shoes squeaking against the wet stone. He says it looks like the other one, Doctor, but different." "Different how?" "No cutting of the belly, just the throat." Phillips turned from the window, the glass cold against his spine, and reached for his bag. The handle felt slick under his palm, residue from the previous examination clinging to the leather like a second skin. He grabbed his coat, shoving his arms into the sleeves without undoing the buttons, the fabric bunching awkwardly around his elbows as he moved. "Leave the notes, Thomas," Phillips called over his shoulder, not waiting to see if the clerk obeyed. "Lock the cabinet, burn the rags." "Sir," Thomas's voice cracked, a high, thin sound of protest. "Burn them," Phillips repeated, stepping past Spratling into the corridor, where the smell of damp wool and stale tobacco hung thick in the air. "I want no trace of her left on this table when I return." They moved quickly through the station, the constables parting like water before a prow, their faces pale and drawn in the gaslight. Outside, the fog had descended fully, a yellow-grey soup that coated the tongue with the taste of coal dust and river mud. The hansom cab waited at the curb, the horse stamping impatiently, its breath pluming white in the chill air, hooves striking the pavement with a rhythmic, hollow clatter that echoed off the brickwork of the buildings opposite. "Burner Street," Phillips barked, climbing in before the driver could descend. "Drive." The cab lurched forward, the wheels splashing through the gutter water, sending a spray of filth against the window pane. Phillips leaned back, closing his eyes, but the image of Mary Ann's exposed abdomen burned behind his lids, the jagged edges of the wound seeming to pulse in time with the rattling of the carriage springs. He pressed his thumb against the bridge of his nose, trying to massaging away the headache blooming there, a tight band of pain that squeezed his temples. "Did the constable say if she was identified?" Phillips asked, his voice rough. Spratling shook his head, a motion barely visible in the gloom, confirming there was no purse and no papers. She had been lying near the gate when a man named Deemschutz found her, claiming his horse shied at the body. "Shied," Phillips repeated, the word tasting bitter. "Horses know the scent of blood before men do." The journey was a blur of jolting cobbles and swaying lanterns, the city outside reduced to smudges of orange light and shadowy figures huddled in doorways. When the cab finally halted, the sudden stillness made Phillips's stomach lurch. He stepped down onto the wet pavement, his boots sinking slightly into the mud that coated the street. Dutfield's Yard was narrow, choked with the shadows of the warehouse walls that rose on either side like cliffs. A crowd had already gathered at the entrance, held back by two uniformed constables whose faces were flushed with the effort of maintaining order. The murmur of voices stopped as Phillips approached, 100 eyes fixing on the black bag in his hand, the silent acknowledgement of his grim authority. "Make way," Spratling shouted, pushing through the press of bodies. Clear the yard. Phillips followed, his footsteps echoing on the wet stones. In the center of the yard, beneath the faint glow of a single gas jet that flickered in the draught, lay the body. Elizabeth Stride. She lay on her back, her limbs arranged with an unnatural stillness. Phillips knelt beside her, the dampness of the ground seeping instantly through the knees of his trousers. He did not hesitate. He pulled back the shawl that had been draped over her face, revealing features that were already beginning to swell with the onset of congestion. Her eyes were open, staring up at the sliver of sky visible between the rooftops, the pupils fixed and dilated. Time of death, Phillips asked, though he knew the answer would be an estimate at best. Within the last 20 minutes, a voice replied. Inspector Long stood in the shadows, his collar turned up against the mist. Deemschutz found her at 1:16, says he drove in, lit his pipe, and saw her when he struck the match. Phillips nodded, turning his attention to the wound. It was a single incision, clean, precise, running from the left side of the neck across to the right, severing the carotid artery and the windpipe. Blood had pooled beneath the head, a dark, viscous lake that had not yet begun to clot, spreading outwards in a jagged starburst pattern across the cobblestones. There was no spray on the wall behind her, no splatter on the gate. The blood had flowed downward, gravity doing its work after the heart had stopped pumping. He ran a gloved finger along the edge of the wound, feeling the smoothness of the cut. The skin had parted easily, the knife sharp, the hand steady. No other injuries? Phillips asked, his voice low. None, Long replied, stepping closer. We've checked. No bruising on the arms, no defensive wounds. She didn't struggle. And the abdomen? Intact. Phillips paused, his hand hovering over the woman's stomach. He pressed gently against the fabric of her dress, feeling the contour of the body beneath. Soft, unbroken, no probing, no slicing, no removal of organs. He sat back on his heels, the mud staining his coat. He was interrupted, Phillips said, the words hanging heavy in the damp air. Long frowned, leaning down to inspect the wound again, and demanded, interrupted, by whom? The yard had been empty when Deemschutz arrived, yet the gate remained locked from the inside. By the arrival of the cart, Phillips corrected, gesturing towards the horse standing nervously at the far end of the yard. Or perhaps a sound, a footstep. It matters little. He looked up at Long, his face grim in the flickering light. What matters is that he intended to do more, this cut. He traced the line of the throat again, careful not to touch the blood. This is merely the opening. The work was not finished. Not finished, Long repeated, the implications settling over them like the fog. He meant to do to her what was done to Nichols. Precisely. Phillips stood up, wiping his gloves on a rag Sprattling handed him. He wanted the abdomen, he wanted the organs, but something spooked him. He fled before he could make the second cut. A shout erupted from the street. The crowd at the gate surged forward, the constables struggling to hold the line. Get them back, Long roared, turning towards the disturbance. Phillips ignored the commotion. He looked down at Elizabeth Stride, at the terrible simplicity of her death. She had been granted a mercy of sorts, a quick end before the true horror could begin, but the mercy was accidental, a byproduct of the killer's haste, not his compassion. Cover her face, Phillips ordered softly. Spratling moved to obey, pulling the shawl back over the swollen features. Doctor, Long called, turning back from the gate. There's word from Mitre Square, another body just found. The air left Phillips's lungs. He gripped the handle of his bag, his knuckles white against the black leather. Mitre Square, he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Yes, Eddowes, Catherine Eddowes. As the name left his lips, Long's face turned pale, the color drained by the news. They say it's worse, Doctor, much worse. Phillips closed his eyes for a second, the image of the clean cut at Berner Street colliding violently with the memory of Mary Ann Nichols's ruined abdomen. 2 women, 1 night. The killer had not fled. He had simply moved on, hungry and unfinished. Take me there, Phillips said, his voice hardening into something cold and brittle. Now. He stepped over the pooling blood, the mud sucking at his boots as he moved towards the gate, towards the waiting cab, towards the next circle of hell that awaited him in the fog. The crowd parted silently before him, sensing the urgency in his stride, the terrible purpose that drove him forward into the dark. The cab horse slipped on the wet cobbles near Aldgate, a sharp crack of hoof against stone that sent a jolt through the floorboards and up into Phillips's shins. He did not flinch. The jarring vibration was nothing compared to the tremor threatening to seize his hands, a physical rebellion he suppressed by gripping the leather strap until his fingernails turned the color of old parchment. Outside, the fog had thickened, no longer a mere mist, but a solid yellow-grey wall that pressed against the glass, swallowing the gas lamps whole and leaving the city blind. Mitre Square, the driver called back, his voice muffled by the wool scarf wrapped tight around his throat. Near the police station, they've got the whole bloody lane cordoned off. Drive, Phillips said. The word came out flat, stripped of any plea or command, merely a statement of inevitable motion. The wheels groaned over the uneven pavement, the rhythmic clatter doing little to drown out the thought that had taken root in the surgeon's mind since leaving Berner Street. Unfinished. The word echoed with the precision of a scalpel striking bone. At Bucks Row, Mary Ann Nichols had been opened like a prize hog, her abdomen a ruin of exposed viscera that had tested the limits of Phillips's own stomach. Then Stride, throat cut with surgical neatness, the work aborted before the knife could descend below the ribs. A hesitation, or a relocation, the mathematics of the night suggested a predator who did not tire, who did not falter, but who simply adjusted his coordinates when the light failed or a witness approached. The cab lurched to a halt, the sudden stop throwing Phillips forward against the seat back. He was out before the driver could descend, his boots hitting the slick stone of Mitre Square with a splash that sent a spray of filthy water up his trouser legs. The cold bit instantly, seeping through the wool, but the smell hit him first. It was not just blood. Blood, fresh and warm, carried a specific, iron-heavy scent that clung to the back of the throat. This was different. This was the sour, bowel-loosening stench of opened entrails left too long in the chill air, mixed with the acrid tang of urine and the underlying rot of the city's refuse. It was a thick, cloying miasma that seemed to coat the tongue, making swallowing an act of will. "Doctor!" Inspector Watkins stepped from the shadows near the corner of the square, his face grey in the gloom, eyes wide and unblinking. He did not offer a hand. He merely gestured towards the ground near the railway arch, a movement so stiff it looked mechanical. "God help us," Watkins muttered, the words escaping like steam from a cracked pipe. Though he had witnessed war before, telling the doctor how he'd seen men torn apart by shellfire in the Sudan, he insisted this was something else entirely. Phillips moved past him, his black bag swinging heavily at his side. He forced his gaze downward, preparing himself for the worst, yet the reality of the scene still struck him with the force of a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. Catherine Eddowes lay on her back, her body angled awkwardly against the curb. Where Stride had been granted a terrible, accidental mercy, Eddowes had been subjected to a meticulous, prolonged dismantling. The throat was cut, yes, deep and savage, but that was merely the prelude. The abdomen was a cavity of horrors, the skin peeled back in great flaps to reveal the dark, glistening organs beneath, which had been partially removed and arranged with a grotesque deliberation that defied any rational understanding of butchery. But it was the face that arrested Phillips's attention, freezing the blood in his veins. Nose was gone, sliced away with a precision that suggested a steady hand and a sharp instrument. The cheeks had been carved into, the flesh undercut and pulled back, exposing the teeth in a permanent, rictus grin that bore no resemblance to the woman she had been in life. One ear bore a deep incision, severed nearly through. It was not the rage of a drunkard or the frenzy of a madman. It was the work of someone who knew exactly where to cut to achieve maximum disfigurement with minimum effort. "Jesus Christ," Phillips whispered, the oath slipping out before he could check it. He dropped to his knees, the dampness of the square soaking through his trousers once more, but he felt nothing of the cold. His world had narrowed to the expanse of ruined flesh before him. He reached out, his gloved fingers trembling slightly as he hovered over the abdominal cavity. The wound was extensive, running from the sternum down to the pubis, with lateral incisions branching off like the roots of a poisoned tree. "Time?" Phillips asked, his voice sounding distant to his own ears, as if spoken from the bottom of a well. "Same as the other," Watkins replied, stepping closer but keeping his distance from the body. "Found by PC Watkins at 1:45, less than an hour after Stride. He heard a cry, ran to the spot, found her like this." "Less than an hour," Phillips repeated. The implications settled over him, heavy and suffocating. The killer had moved from Burner Street to Mitre Square, a distance of nearly a mile, in the space of 30 minutes. He had killed, mutilated, and vanished into the fog before the first body had even begun to stiffen. Phillips leaned in closer, the smell of opened bowels rising to meet him, cloying and sweet. He examined the edges of the abdominal wound. The cuts were clean, the angles precise. This was not the hacking of a slaughterhouse knife wielded in anger. This was anatomy. "He took something," Phillips said, his eyes scanning the cavity, noting the absence of specific organs. The uterus was gone, severed with a skill that spoke of familiarity with female physiology. And there, in the darkness of the left flank, a void where the kidney should have rested. "Took what?" Watkins asked, his voice tight. "Parts," Phillips said, lifting his gaze to meet the inspector's. His face was mask-like, the horror banked behind a wall of professional necessity, but his eyes betrayed a deep, vibrating exhaustion. "He did not just kill her, Inspector. He harvested her, as one might take cuts from a beast at Smithfield." He sat back on his heels, wiping a smear of blood from his glove onto the wet stone. The contrast between the two scenes of the night was absolute. Stride, untouched save for the throat, a testament to interruption. Eddowes, flayed and emptied, a testament to completion. The killer had adapted, learned, and escalated within the span of a single carriage ride. "Did he use a light?" Phillips asked, looking around the dark square. The gas jet above them flickered weakly, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to reach for the body. "No," Watkins said. "In the dark. He did this in the dark." Phillips closed his eyes for a brief second, summoning the image of the clean cut at Burner Street, then overlaying it with the butchery at his feet. The duality was terrifying. It suggested a mind that could switch between modes of operation with chilling efficiency, dictated not by emotion, but by opportunity. "We need bags," Phillips said, opening his own satchel and retrieving a roll of oilcloth. "And a jar, a large one. If he has taken the kidney, he may have left traces, tissue, blood, anything." "You think he'll come back?" Watkins asked, a note of panic edging into his tone. "No," Phillips said, his voice hardening as he added that the killer takes his trophies and keeps them. He looked up at the inspector, his expression grim, to declare that this was not merely murder, Watkins, but a statement which only they could read. He began to work, his movements becoming rhythmic, automated, the surgeon taking over where the man faltered. He probed the wound, feeling for the edges of the incisions, mapping the trajectory of the blade. Each touch confirmed his growing dread. The killer possessed a knowledge of anatomy that far exceeded that of a common cutthroat. This was the hand of someone who had held a scalpel before, who understood the resistance of skin and the give of muscle. After a long silence, Phillips ordered, his voice rough, "Cover her," he added, "but do not clean the face, not yet. Let the photographer see it as it is," he insisted, "for the world must know the extent of this depravity." Watkins nodded, signaling to a constable who approached with a sheet, his face pale and sickly in the gloom. As the fabric drifted down, obscuring the ruined features of Catherine Eddowes, Phillips stood up. His knees cracked, a dry, brittle sound in the quiet square. He wiped his hands on a rag, the stain of blood already seeping through the linen, a permanent mark of the night's work. "Doctor," Watkins said, gesturing towards the edge of the square. "The press, they're gathering, and the people." Phillips turned. Through the thinning veil of fog, he saw them. A crowd had formed beyond the cordon, a sea of pale, upturned faces illuminated by the flaring matchsticks of newsboys and the flickering glow of torches held by curious locals. They did not cheer. They did not shout. They stood in a hushed, terrified silence, their eyes fixed on the spot where the sheet now covered the dead woman. It was a congregation of the living, gathered to witness the aftermath of the dead. And in their silence, Phillips heard the true horror of the evening. The secret was out. The nightmare was no longer confined to the dark alleys and the morgue. It had stepped into the light, and the city was finally fully awake to the monster walking its streets. He adjusted his collar, feeling the weight of the oilcloth-wrapped samples in his bag, and stepped towards the crowd, ready to face the questions he could not answer. The oilcloth crinkled, a sharp, dry protest against the wet night, as Phillips unrolled it across the slick cobblestones beside the body. He needed a vessel, glass, something that would not react with the spirits he carried, something that could seal the evidence of what was missing from this woman's interior. His fingers, stiff from the cold and the grip of his instruments, fumbled briefly with the cork stopper of the jar he had retrieved from his bag. It stuck. He twisted, applied pressure, felt the grind of glass on glass, then the sudden pop as the vacuum broke. The smell of methylated spirits surged up, sharp and chemical, fighting a losing battle against the coppery reek of the open grave before him. "Hand me the forceps," he said, not looking at Watkins. The inspector passed them over, the metal cold and heavy in Phillips's palm. He leaned in again, pushing back the edge of the sheet just enough to expose the ravaged cavity of the abdomen. The gaslight above sputtered, casting a jaundiced glow over the ruin of Catherine Eddowes. Here in the dark, the killer had worked with a precision that defied the chaos of the alley. This was not the frantic hacking of a rage-filled brute. This was surgery, or something close enough to mimic it in the blood-slicked dark. Phillips inserted the tips of the forceps into the left flank. The tissue gave way, soft and yielding, but the space where the kidney should have rested was empty, a void. He probed deeper, feeling for the renal artery, tracing the path where the blade had severed the organ from its moorings. Clean cuts, no tearing. The angle of the incision suggested a right-handed man, standing to the victim's left, perhaps straddling her, working with a steady hand while the life drained out of her onto the stones of Mitre Square. "He took the left," Phillips murmured, more to himself than to the men watching him, noting how specific and deliberate the removal of part of the uterus had been. "Why those?" Watkins asked, the question hanging in the fog like smoke, drifting before he pressed further. "Why not the heart, the liver, something valuable?" "Valuable to whom?" Phillips straightened, wiping the forceps on a clean section of the oilcloth before dropping them into the jar. He reached for a pair of scissors, the blades gleaming dull in the low light. To a butcher, the offal is waste. To a surgeon, it is anatomy. To this man, it is a requirement. He cut a small sample of the remaining tissue, a fragment of the mesentery that still clung to the abdominal wall. It was a grisly harvest, but necessary. If the killer had taken the kidney, he might have left traces of his own blood, or a fiber from his clothing, or some microscopic clue that the naked eye could not see, but that might, in the hands of a chemist, yield a name, or at least a direction. Phillips placed the fragment into the jar, watching it sink into the clear liquid, swirling slowly before settling at the bottom like a piece of driftwood in a storm-tossed sea. "The skill," Phillips said, his voice low, rough with a fatigue that went deeper than bone. "It is not common, Inspector. A slaughterman knows how to bleed a beast, how to dress a carcass for market. But this," he gestured with the scissors, the tip tracing the air above the wound, "this requires knowledge of the retroperitoneal space, of the vascular supply." He knew exactly where to cut to remove the organ without damaging the surrounding structures unnecessarily. He knew what he was looking for. "You're saying he's a doctor?" Watkins's voice tightened, a note of disbelief warring with the dread in his eyes. "I am saying he has handled a scalpel," Phillips corrected, capping the jar and tightening the lid until his knuckles turned white. "Whether in a hospital, a dissecting room, or a slaughterhouse, I cannot say, but he is not ignorant. He is not guessing." He placed the jar into his satchel, nestling it between rolls of bandage and bottles of antiseptic. The weight of it felt disproportionate, a small glass cylinder containing the only tangible link to a monster who had vanished into the fog less than an hour ago. Outside the square, the rain had begun to fall again, a fine, misty drizzle that coated the cobblestones in a slick sheen, washing the blood from the edges of the crime scene, diluting the evidence with every passing minute. "Cover her face properly," Phillips ordered, standing up and brushing the damp from his trousers. "But leave the body as is until the photographer arrives. I want the position of the limbs recorded, the placement of the clothing, everything." "It's getting worse, Doctor," Watkins said, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a whisper as if the dead woman might hear. "The people, they're saying it's a gang, or a foreigner, or a madman sent by the devil himself." "Let them say what they will," Phillips replied, adjusting his collar against the chill. "Rumor is a fever that burns itself out, but facts are the only cure we have." He turned away from the body, from the sheet that now concealed the horrors he had just documented, and walked towards the edge of the square. The fog had thickened, rolling in from the Thames like a living thing, swallowing the gas lamps and blurring the outlines of the buildings until the world seemed to shrink to the size of this single, blood-stained patch of pavement. And there, beyond the cordon of constables, stood the crowd. They were not shouting, they were not surging against the police line. They stood in a dense, silent mass, their faces upturned, pale and ghostly in the gloom. Men in caps, women in shawls, children perched on shoulders, all staring at the spot where Catherine Eddowes lay. Their silence was worse than any riot. It was the silence of recognition. They knew now that the terror was not a rumor, not a story printed in the papers to sell copies. It was here, in their square, on their streets. Phillips felt a shiver run through him, unrelated to the cold. He had spent the night cataloguing death, dissecting the mechanics of murder with the detached eye of science. But this was something else. This was the city waking up to its own vulnerability. The fog did not just hide the killer, it hid them all from each other, turning neighbor into stranger, friend into potential prey. "Doctor," Watkins called from behind him, the sound muffled by the mist. Phillips did not answer immediately. He watched the crowd, seeing the fear in their eyes, the way they clutched their coats tighter, the way they shifted their weight as if ready to run. They were waiting for him to speak, to offer some reassurance, some explanation that would make the nightmare make sense. But he had nothing to give them. No name, no motive, no end to the story. He tightened his grip on the handle of his satchel, feeling the glass jar inside bump against his hip, a hard, cold reminder of the truth he carried. The killer was gone. The evidence was secured. But the hunt had only just begun, and the fog was getting thicker. "Come along, Watkins," Phillips said, his voice cutting through the damp air as he reminded them that work remained to be done, and the night was far from over. He stepped forward towards the crowd, towards the questions he could not answer, towards the long, dark walk back to the mortuary where the dead waited in rows, silent and patient, for him to tell their stories one last time. Ink pooled in the dip of the tea, a black tear threatening to spill onto the ledger's ruled line. Lusk wiped the nib on his sleeve, leaving a dark smear against the coarse wool, and rubbed his eyes until stars burst behind the lids. The clock on the mantel ticked, loud, deliberate, each second a hammer blow against the quiet of the parlor, measuring out the patience he no longer possessed. Outside, the wind scraped against the windowpane, a dry, rattling sound like bone on glass, but inside the air sat heavy and still, thick with the scent of stale tobacco and the damp wool of coats left too long on the stand. "Useless," he muttered, the word catching in a throat roar from shouting orders at men who would not listen. Every single one of them useless. He dragged the ledger closer, the leather binding groaning in protest, and scanned the column for Tuesday's patrol again, though he had read it a dozen times already since supper. Names, times, streets. A grid of order imposed on a district that laughed at order, a fragile net cast over a shark-infested sea. 30 men signed up for the Vigilance Committee, yet only 12 had shown for the walk along Commercial Street last night, and 3 of those had slipped away before midnight, claiming a need for brandy or a word with a constable who never materialized. The police stood at the corners, hands in pockets, watching the fog roll in with the passive indifference of statues, while the women of Whitecapel huddled in doorways, eyes darting, waiting for the shadow that moved faster than the law. A knock at the door shattered the silence. Lusk jumped, his elbow knocking the inkwell. Black liquid surged, flooding the space between Miller's Court and Dorset Street, obscuring the names, swallowing the plan. He swore, a sharp, ugly sound that bounced off the wallpaper, and grabbed for the rag beside the blotter. The stain spread anyway, creeping into the fibers of the paper, turning the careful script into a Rorschach blot of failure. "Mr. Lusk," the voice arrived muffled through the wood, thin and hesitant, to announce, "Parcel for you, sir. Special delivery." Not now, Lusk snapped, scrubbing at the page until the paper began to pill and tear. Tell them I am not receiving. Tell them the committee is closed. It's not a man, sir, just a box, left on the step. No name on it, but the boy who found it says it smells odd. Lusk stopped scrubbing. The rag hung limp in his hand, stained black. Odd smells in Whitecapel usually meant one of three things: gin, offal, or the river at low tide. None warranted interrupting a man trying to salvage a disintegrating defense strategy. Yet the boy's tone, that specific tremor of youthful fear, snagged something in his chest. He dropped the rag and stood, his knees popping, the stiffness of a day spent hunched over maps and petitions protesting in every joint. "Leave it by the mat," he called, moving towards the hall. "I will see to it." He unlocked the chain, the metal clinking loudly in the narrow space, and pulled the door open. The step was empty save for a small package wrapped in brown paper, tied with a rough string that looked as if it had been cut with a blunt knife. No footprints led away. The fog had swallowed the messenger, or perhaps there had never been a messenger at all, just a hand appearing from the grey to deposit the thing and vanish. Lusk bent, his breath hitching as a draft swept up from the cellar, and lifted the box. It was heavier than it looked, dense. He carried it into the parlor, setting it on the table beside the ruined ledger. The paper wrapping was greasy, stained with spots that looked like water but felt slick to the touch. He picked up a pair of scissors from the desk, the steel cold against his palm, and sliced the twine. The knot resisted, tight and stubborn, forcing him to saw at it, the friction burning his fingertips. When the string finally gave, it fell away with a soft thud, and Lusk peeled back the layers of brown paper. Inside lay a cardboard box, the kind a butcher might use for scraps, the edges softened by moisture. He lifted the lid. The smell hit him first. It was not the sweet rot of the gutters, nor the sharp sting of the chemical wards. It was something older, deeper, a cloying, alcoholic stench mixed with the coppery tang of old blood and the unmistakable earthy odor of preserved flesh. Formaldehyde, spirits of wine. And beneath it, the faint, sickly scent of decay that no amount of preservative could entirely mask. Lusk recoiled, his chair scraping violently against the floorboards as he shoved himself backward, his hand flying to cover his mouth. In the box, nestled in a bed of damp cotton wool, sat a kidney. It was pale, waxy, the color of wet clay, shriveled slightly by the preserving fluid but unmistakably human. Half of one. The cut edge was clean, precise, the work of a blade that knew exactly where to slice, separating the organ with a surgeon's economy. Lusk stared at it, his brain refusing to process the image, trying to categorize it as a prank, a piece of pork from the market, anything but what his eyes insisted it was. Then he saw the letter. Tucked beneath the cotton, folded into a rough square, was a sheet of paper covered in a scrawling, illiterate hand. The ink was fresh, glistening wetly in the gaslight. He reached out, his fingers trembling so badly he could barely pinch the corner, and lifted it. "From hell, Mr. Lusk. Sir, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, and preserved it for you t'other piece I fried and ate. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody niff that took it out, if you only wait a will longer. Signed, Catch me when you can, Mrs. Lusk." The words swam before his eyes, the misspellings jagged teeth in a mouth full of lies, yet the claim sat heavy and solid as the stone in his gut. Half the kidney. He looked back at the box, at the pale, shriveled mass floating in its own juices. Catherine Eddowes, Mitre Square. The reports had been vague, whispered among the doctors and the detectives, but the rumor had circulated through the vigilance meetings like smoke. A kidney missing. The left one, taken with skill. Lusk dropped the letter. It fluttered down, landing face up on the table, the words "I fried and ate it" staring up at the ceiling. His stomach lurched, a violent spasm that doubled him over, and he gagged, dry heaving into the handkerchief he clutched. The smell of the spirits of wine seemed to expand, filling the room, coating the back of his throat, tasting of grave dirt and cheap gin. He stumbled to the window, wrenching it open, gasping for the cold, foggy air, but the wind only pushed the scent back at him, trapping him in his own parlor with the evidence. They had laughed at him in the papers, called him a busybody, a builder playing at detective while the professionals handled the work. But the professionals had no answer, no suspect, no end to the slaughter. And now the killer was here, in his home, sending him pieces of the dead as if they were cuts of meat from a stall, mocking the very idea of justice, of order, of the thin blue line that was supposed to hold the chaos at bay. He turned back to the table, his legs shaking so hard he had to grip the edge to stay upright. The kidney sat there, innocent and horrific, a silent testament to a brutality that defied comprehension. This was no hoax. No drunken prankster could replicate the precise cut, the specific preservation, the intimate knowledge of what had been taken from the woman in the square. This was a message, a challenge. Catch me when you can. Lusk reached for the bell pull, his hand missing twice before finding the cord. He yanked it, the chime ringing shrill and desperate in the hallway, summoning the maid, summoning anyone who could bear witness to this violation. But even as the sound echoed, he knew who he truly needed. Not the police, not the press. He needed the man who spoke the language of the dead, the only one who could look at that shriveled flesh and tell him if it was truly hers. He grabbed a fresh sheet of paper, his pen scratching wildly across the surface as he wrote the address, the ink splattering like blood drops on the white page. Phillips. He needed Phillips before the smell faded, before the evidence could be dismissed as another fever dream of a terrified city. The maid's footsteps hurried down the hall, slow and cautious, but Lusk was already moving, pushing the box towards the center of the table, arranging the letter so the surgeon would see the words first. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone, and the taste of bile lingered on his tongue, sharp and unforgiving. The war was no longer on the streets. It had crossed the threshold. It was sitting in his parlor, pickling in a box, waiting for the doctor to arrive and confirm that the monster was real and that he was hungry. The bell still vibrated in the wall, a dying insect buzz that failed to mask the wet slap of his own pulse against his ears. Lusk wiped his mouth with the back of a hand that felt numb, useless, as if the blood had drained from it entirely. He could not look at the box again. Not yet. The organ sat there, a pale, shriveled lump in its bath of spirits, radiating a coldness that seemed to leach the warmth from the entire room, turning the familiar comfort of his parlor into a charnel house. Catherine. The name formed in his throat, dry and brittle, but he could not force it past his lips. Catherine Eddowes, a woman who had laughed in the face of poverty, or so the stories went, a woman who talked too much for her own good, who used wit as a shield against the crushing weight of the casual wards. And now she was reduced to this, a fraction of flesh in a cardboard crate, a trophy sent to a builder's home in Mile End, while the rest of her lay under the earth or perhaps, God forbid, scattered in the gutters of White-Capel. The thought of the other half of the half the writer claimed to have fried, to have eaten, curdled the bile in his stomach anew. It was a lie. It had to be a lie. A grotesque fancy of a madman trying to shock the Vigilance Committee into dissolution. Yet the cut on the kidney before him was clean, precise, surgical. No butcher sent a kidney in a box with a letter written in such frantic, illiterate scrawl. No prankster knew which organ had been taken from the woman in Mitre Square. The police had kept that detail close, whispering it only behind closed doors, shielding the public from the full extent of the butchery. Only the killer would know. Only the man who held the knife would know the weight of the flesh he had removed, the specific texture of the life he had extinguished. Lusk paced the room, 3 steps to the fireplace, 3 steps back, his boots thudding heavily on the floorboards. The rug smelled of dust and old tobacco, a domestic scent that now felt like a mockery. How could he sit here? How could he drink tea in this room again, knowing that the air had been fouled by the breath of a monster? The window stood open, the fog curling in like a living thing, grey and thick, swallowing the gaslight from the street outside. It offered no cleansing breeze, only a damp, chilling embrace that carried the soot and stench of the city straight to his desk. He stopped pacing and gripped the mantelpiece, his knuckles white against the dark wood. The image of the letter burned behind his eyelids. I send you half the kidney. The misspelling was almost comical, a child's error, yet the sentiment was pure evil. It was a taunt directed specifically at him, at his committee, at the futile patrols they had organized, the men marching with truncheons and lanterns, while the killer slipped through the shadows, cutting and taking and sending parcels through the post as if ordering goods from a catalogue. A noise in the hallway made him flinch, a sharp intake of breath that he could not suppress. The maid, she was coming. He had to compose himself. He could not let her see the shaking, the sweat that beaded on his forehead despite the chill. He was George Lusk, chairman of the White-Capel Vigilance Committee, a man of substance, a builder who had raised houses and walls and fences against the encroaching squalor. He could not crumble before a servant. He snatched the letter from the table, folding it hastily, shoving it into his pocket, as if the paper itself might burn him. Then he took a clean handkerchief from his waistcoat and wiped his mouth again, pressing the linen hard against his lips until the fabric tasted of salt and fear. He turned to face the door just as the handle began to turn, forcing his shoulders back, lifting his chin in a gesture of defiance that felt hollow, fragile as glass. "So," the maid, Mrs. Vesey, peered around the edge of the door, her face pale, eyes wide with a confusion that bordered on terror. She had heard the bell. She had heard the retching. She smelled the air, that cloying chemical stench that hung heavy and unnatural in the room. Her gaze darted to the open window, then to the box on the table, though she could not yet see what lay inside. "Close the door, Mrs. Vesey," Lusk said, his voice rough, scraped raw by the acid of his own vomit, "and do not enter further." She hesitated, her hand tightening on the knob. "Mr. Lusk," the question hung in the air before she rushed on, voice trembling. "Is there a gas leak?" She trailed off, overwhelmed by the scent, the smell. "There is no leak," he snapped, the sharpness of his tone making her flinch. He softened his voice, effort costing him dearly. "A delivery, a scientific specimen for Dr. Phillips. It has upset my stomach, that is all, nothing more." "A specimen," she frowned, stepping slightly into the room despite his command, her nose wrinkling as the odor of the spirits of wine assaulted her senses. "It smells like the mortuary, sir." "Do as I say," Lusk ordered, pointing a trembling finger at the corridor. "Stay in the kitchen, do not come out until I ring again, and if anyone calls anyone at Allah, you are to send them directly to me. Do not speak to them, do not take any packages. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." She backed away, pulling the door closed with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the sudden silence. Lusk exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to empty his lungs completely. He was alone again with the box. The reprieve was momentary, a brief pause in the assault before the next wave crashed over him. He looked down at the table, at the cotton wool soaked in fluid, at the pale, waxy curve of the kidney. It did not look like an organ of a human being. It looked like something dredged from a riverbank, a stone worn smooth by water, devoid of life, devoid of soul. But it had been inside a woman. It had filtered blood. It had been part of the machinery that kept Catherine Eddowes alive, that allowed her to speak, to laugh, to beg for coins, to fear the dark. And now it was here on his table, a silent witness to a crime that transcended mere murder. This was desecration. This was a declaration of war against the very notion of humanity. He reached out, his hand hovering over the box, then pulled back as if burned. He could not touch it again, not without gloves, not without the presence of a man who understood the language of flesh and bone. He needed Phillips. He needed the surgeon's cold, clinical eye to strip away the horror and replace it with fact. If Phillips said it was a pig's kidney, then it was a prank. If Phillips said it was human, then the devil himself walked the streets of White-Capel, and he had just invited him into his home. The wait stretched, each second ticking by with agonizing slowness. The gaslight hissed, a faint, serpentine sound that seemed to mimic the whisper of the letter. "Catch me when you can." The words echoed in the quiet room, mocking his patrols, his meetings, his fervent belief that order could be imposed on chaos through sheer will and civic duty. What was a vigilance committee against a man who cooked the flesh of his victims? What was a builder's resolve against a monster who treated the dead as provisions? Lusk sank into his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. He rested his elbows on his knees, burying his face in his hands. The smell was everywhere now, ingrained in the curtains, the carpet, the very walls. He would never scrub it out. He would never sit in this room without tasting the spirits of wine on the back of his tongue, without seeing the pale, shriveled mass floating in its own juices. The violation was complete. The killer had not just taken a life. He had invaded the sanctuary of the living, turning a home into a morgue, a chairman into a trembling child. Footsteps sounded on the pavement outside, heavy and purposeful, stopping at his gate. A knock came at the front door, solid and authoritative. Phillips. Lusk lifted his head, his eyes stinging, his throat tight. He stood up, his legs feeling like lead, and walked towards the hallway to admit the only man who could bear witness to this hell. The box sat on the table, waiting, the fluid inside still, the kidney silent in its grave of cotton and glass. The real examination was about to begin, and Lusk feared that whatever truth Phillips uncovered would be far worse than the fear that already consumed him. Ink stained the cuticle of Reed's left thumb, a permanent black crescent that no amount of scrubbing with sand soap could erase. He rubbed the skin raw, watching the epidermis flake away under the gas jet, yet the stain remained, deep as a bruise. "Another one," he muttered. The paper crumpled in his fist, the sound sharp and dry like a bone snapping. He tossed it onto the pile already choking the corner of his desk, a mountain of nonsense written in charcoal, pencil, and cheap red ink. 43 letters since Tuesday, 43 claims of authorship from men who could barely spell White-Capel, let alone orchestrate the butchery of a woman in Mitre Square. Journalists, mostly, or drunkards seeking a pint's worth of fame from a terrified public. They wrote of knives that sang and blood that flowed like wine, poetic nonsense that made Reed's stomach turn over. He reached for the ceramic pitcher on the sideboard, the water inside lukewarm and tasting faintly of the iron pipes that fed it. Pouring a glass, he watched the liquid wobble, the surface reflecting the flickering mantle above. His hand did not shake, it never shook, but the fatigue sat behind his eyes, a heavy wet wool blanket that muffled his thoughts and slowed his reflexes. "So?" Reed jumped, the water sloshing over the rim of the glass and onto the blotter. Constable Miller stood in the doorway, cap crushed against his chest, his face pale and drawn tight across the cheekbones. The boy looked as though he hadn't slept since the first body was found in Buck's Row. "Did I give you leave to loiter, Miller?" Reed's voice came out sharper than intended, a reflexive snap of authority to cover the startle. "No, sir, apologies." Miller shifted his weight, boots scuffing the floorboards. "It's the post, sir. Another batch arrived from the sorting office. They didn't know what to do with them, said the clerks were refusing to handle the envelopes." "Let them burn," Reed said, turning back to the desk, "or feed them to the rats." He did not care which. "They marked this one, sir." Miller stepped forward, placing a single envelope on the edge of the desk, keeping his fingers well clear of the paper as if it carried the plague. Red chalk, on the front, no stamp, hand-delivered to the station house 10 minutes ago by a lad who said a gentleman in a tall hat gave him a tuppence to run fast. Reed froze. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the smell of stale tobacco and damp wool suddenly cloying. He slowly set the glass down. The water inside had settled, perfectly still. "Show me." Miller retreated a step, leaving the envelope isolated on the mahogany. Reed picked it up with the tips of his index finger and thumb. The paper was rough, cheap stock, the kind sold in penny packets at any stationer's on Commercial Street. But the writing on the front was distinct, the loops of the letters sharp and aggressive, the ink a dark, viscous crimson that smelled faintly of copper and something else, something chemical and biting. "To the boss." Reed turned it over, sealed with wax but no crest, just a smear of red that looked too much like dried blood to be comfortable. He took a letter opener from the tray, the steel cold against his palm, and slit the top. Shaking the contents onto the blotter, a single sheet of foolscap slid out, covered in the same jagged hand. He began to read. The words marched across the page, a rhythmic, taunting cadence that felt less like a confession and more like a performance. "Dear boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about leather apron gave me real fits. I am down on whores, and I shall not leave off ripping till I do get buckled." Reed stopped, his breath hitched in his throat, a sudden, painful obstruction. He forced himself to continue, the words burning into his retina. "Great work that last job was. I gave the lady no time to even squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear of me with my funny little games. I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough though. Ha ha." The handwriting danced. It mocked him. It mocked the 43 other letters, the thousands of man-hours spent chasing shadows, the dignity of the dead women reduced to punchlines in a joker's game. Sir Miller's voice was small, trembling. Is it him? Reed looked up. The constable's eyes were wide, fixed on the red scroll with a mixture of horror and fascination. It is a hoax, Reed said, the words tasting like ash. It has to be. No man writes to the police to boast of his crimes unless he wishes to be caught, and this writer is too clever for that, too theatrical. But the details, sir, Miller pressed, stepping closer despite the danger. The last job, the blood in the bottle. The papers haven't printed about the bottle, have they? Only Dr. Phillips and you and the commissioner know about the blood. Reed slammed his hand flat on the desk, the impact making the inkwell jump. Silence, Miller. Do not speak of what you do not understand. The papers print rumors. They print lies. Any drunk in a pub knows there was blood. It takes no genius to guess a killer might keep a trophy. He stood up, pacing the small confines of the office. The floorboards groaned under his boots. He stopped at the window, staring out into the grey afternoon where the fog was beginning to curl around the gas lamps, turning the street below into a swirling void. Somewhere out there, a man walked free. A man who ripped women open and then sat down to write childish taunts with red ink. Or perhaps a man who did nothing of the sort, while the real killer watched from the shadows, laughing at their confusion. If this is a joke, Reed said, his back to the room, it is a cruel one. If it is truth, he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. To admit the letter was genuine was to admit they were hunting a ghost who could penetrate the station house as easily as he penetrated a throat. What are your orders, sir? Miller asked. Shall we circulate it, show it to the press? If the public knows he is writing to us, they might come forward. Someone must have seen the lad who delivered it. Reed turned. He looked at the letter, then at the pile of garbage in the corner. The distinction between the two was vanishing. If he released this, the frenzy would reach a fever pitch. The Vigilance Committee would triple their patrols, Lusk would hold another press conference, and the innocent men of White-Capel would be dragged from their beds for interrogation based on a scribbler's whim. The investigation would drown in noise. And yet, the phrase "funny little games" echoed in his mind. It suggested a mind unmoored, a psyche that viewed murder as entertainment. If such a man existed, he would not stop. He would write again. He would kill again, perhaps specifically to prove the letter was not a lie. Lock it away, Reed said, his voice low and stripped of emotion, commanding that it be secured in the safe with the other evidence from Mitre Square. Do not let a soul see it, not Phillips, not Lusk, and certainly not the reporters. Sir, Miller blinked, confusion warring with obedience. But if it's a laid. It is a trap, Reed snapped, walking back to the desk and sweeping the remaining unopened letters into the bin with a violent arc of his arm. A trap designed to scatter our focus. We chase the writer, we lose the killer. Or worse, we chase a writer who is not the killer, and while we hunt a phantom, the real beast slaughters another woman in the dark. He picked up the glass of water again, his hand steady now, the decision made. The burden of it settled on his shoulders, heavy and cold. He would have to sit on this. He would have to let the press scream for information he possessed, let them call the police incompetent, let the public fear grow until it choked the district. All to preserve the integrity of a single, fragile thread of truth in a tapestry of lies. Take the rest of these to the incinerator, Reed ordered, pointing to the bin. Burn them all, every last one. And Miller. So, if anyone asks, we have received nothing, we know nothing, we are still looking for Leather Apron. Miller nodded, though his face remained pale. He gathered the stack of letters, the rustle of paper sounding like whispers in the quiet room. As he reached the door, he paused, looking back at the inspector who stood alone amidst the shadows of his office. And the red one, sir, the one you kept. Reed looked down at the single sheet of foolscap, the red ink seeming to pulse under the gaslight, alive and hungry. That, Reed said softly, we keep for ourselves until it leads us to a body or a man, whichever comes first. Miller slipped out, closing the door with a click that sealed the room once more. Reed was alone with the letter. He reached for his pen, dipped it in the black ink, and hovered over a fresh sheet of paper. He had a report to file for the commissioner, a lie to craft that would satisfy the superiors at Scotland Yard without revealing the depth of their helplessness. The pen touched the paper, but no words came. Outside, a hawker cried his wares, the sound muffled by the thickening fog, a lonely voice in a city that had forgotten how to listen. The knock arrived not as a request, but as an intrusion, 3 sharp raps that vibrated the wood of the doorframe and shattered the quietude of the office. Reed did not look up immediately. He capped the inkwell, the brass lid clicking against the glass with a sound that felt too loud in the stagnant air. Enter. The door swung open to admit Dr. George Bagster Phillips, whose presence instantly altered the room's atmosphere, filling it with the cloying, sweet-rot scent of carbolic acid and something deeper, older, that clung to the fibers of his wool coat no matter how vigorously he scrubbed. He carried his black bag by the handle, knuckles white, the leather worn smooth at the grip points. Behind him, the corridor buzzed with the low murmur of constables moving papers, a sound like dry leaves skittering over stone. "Inspector," Phillips said, stepping inside and closing the door with his heel. He did not remove his hat. "I require a word before I return to the mortuary." Reed leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning under the shift of his weight. He gestured to the single vacant chair, the one with the broken cane seat that sagged under any burden. "Sit, doctor, or stand, if you prefer. The comfort of this division is not what it once was." Phillips remained standing, his gaze fixed on the desk, where the red letter lay hidden beneath a stack of blue foolscap reports. The surgeon's eyes were bloodshot, the skin beneath them bruised with exhaustion, yet his posture held a rigid, anatomical precision that suggested he was holding himself together by sheer force of will. "The Star," Phillips said, the name dropping from his lips like a verdict. "The evening edition. It arrived 10 minutes ago." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded sheet of newsprint, the paper cheap and greasy, ink still wet enough to smear against his thumb. He tossed it onto the desk. It slid across the polished wood, stopping inches from Reed's hand. The headline screamed in bold, jagged type, "The WHITCHAPL horror, new details of the mutilation." Reed did not touch the paper. He knew what it contained without reading a word. The specific angle of the incision, the absence of certain organs, the precise nature of the throat cutting that had been withheld from the general press release issued 2 days prior. "And," Reed asked, his voice flat, devoid of the frustration churning in his gut. "And the details are mine, Inspector," Phillips said, his voice rising, cracking slightly on the final syllable. "They are drawn from my post-mortem notes, notes taken in the privacy of the mortuary, witnessed only by you, myself, and the constable on duty, notes that have not been filed with the coroner nor released to the public." He took a step forward, the smell of the dead seeming to radiate from him, a physical weight that pressed against Reed's chest. "Someone has spoken. Someone with access to my table has traded the dignity of the dead for a few shillings or a moment of fleeting importance in a public house." Reed picked up the newspaper. The ink smudged on his fingertip, a dark stain that looked suspiciously like dried blood in the dim gaslight. He scanned the column. The writer described the removal of the abdominal wall with a clinical accuracy that chilled him more than the fog outside. It was not speculation, it was transcription. "You suspect me," Reed said. "It was not a question." "I suspect everyone," Phillips replied, the words sharp, brittle. "I suspect the constable who held the lantern. I suspect the clerk who filed the initial report. And yes, Inspector, I suspect the man who sits in this office and decides what the world is allowed to know about butchery." Reed stood up abruptly, the chair scraping harshly against the floorboards. He walked to the window, turning his back on the surgeon, looking out at the grey swirl of the street where the gas lamps were just beginning to flicker into life against the encroaching dusk. A hansom cab rattled past, the horse's hooves striking the pavement with a rhythmic, hollow clatter that sounded like a ticking clock. "If I wished to feed the press, Doctor," Reed said, his reflection ghostly in the glass, "I would not choose the Star. I would choose the Times. I would ensure my name was attached to the revelation, securing my place in history as the man who solved the riddle. I do not deal in scraps." "Then who?" Phillips demanded. He moved closer, invading Reed's space, his hands clenched at his sides. The details are too specific for guesswork. The writer knows the knife entered from the left, severing the carotid before the jugular. He knows the intestines were arranged over the shoulder. These are not rumors circulating in the rookeries. These are facts established by my scalpel. Reed turned slowly. He looked at Phillips, really looked at him, seeing the tremor in the surgeon's hands, the way his breath hitched in his throat. The man was terrified, not of the killer, but of the violation of his own sanctuary. The mortuary was the only place where order still existed, where the chaos of the streets could be reduced to measurements and diagrams. To have that order breached was to admit that the horror had no boundaries. There is a leak, Reed admitted, the concession tasting like ash, but it does not originate from this desk, nor from your table. Then from where? Phillips pressed, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, for the walls do not speak while men do. Men talk, Reed corrected, walking back to the desk and leaning against it, crossing his arms over his chest. They talk in the canteen, they talk in the streets, they talk to their wives, who talk to their neighbors, who talk to the reporters buying drinks at the 10 bells. Information bleeds, doctor. It seeps through the cracks in the floorboards. We are not operating in a vacuum. We are operating in White-Capel, where every soul is desperate for a story that makes them feel relevant, even if that story is written in blood. Phillips shook his head, a jerky, mechanical motion. This is not seepage. This is a floodgates opened with intent. The reporter quotes my phrasing, clean cut, professional hand. These are my words, Inspector, written in my notebook. Reed felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had heard those phrases before, whispered by a constable near the incinerator, muttered by a clerk sorting the mail. The station was riddled with ears, each one tuned to the frequency of scandal. I will speak to the men, Reed said, the promise feeling hollow even as he spoke it. I will remind them of their oaths, of the consequences of breaching confidence. Remind them, Phillips let out a short, bitter laugh that held no humor. Words will not stop this. The next edition will contain more, perhaps a sketch, perhaps the location of the next body before it is even found. He paused, his eyes narrowing, searching Reed's face for a sign of complicity, a flicker of guilt. You must control your house, Inspector. If you cannot, then I shall withhold my findings. I will write nothing down. I will speak to no one but the coroner directly, and I will do so in a locked room. And let the killer roam unchecked, because you fear a newspaper? Reed's voice hardened, the frustration finally breaking through the veneer of calm. If you stop documenting, Doctor, you stop investigating. You become a bystander to slaughter. I am already a bystander, Phillips shouted, the sound echoing off the plaster walls as he insisted that he cuts them open, measures the wounds, and describes the agony, all for what? So that a journalist can turn their suffering into a sideshow, so that you can sit here and debate whether to release a letter written in red ink by a madman or a joker. He grabbed his bag, yanking the handle with such force the leather creaked. Do not lecture me on duty, Inspector Reed. I have seen more of hell in the last month than you will see in a lifetime of chasing shadows. Do not tell me I am not doing my part. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, filled only by the distant wail of a steam whistle from the docks and the rhythmic dripping of a tap in the corner basin. Reed watched the surgeon, seeing the collapse of the man's composure, the fraying of the professional bond that had held them together through Nichols, Chapman, and Stride. Trust was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the print of a newspaper. I did not accuse you of malice, Reed said quietly, his voice low, stripped of its earlier defensiveness. I accused the system, the machine we are trapped inside. Phillips adjusted his coat, pulling the lapels tight against his throat as if warding off a chill. The machine is grinding us to dust, Inspector, and the press is feeding on the scraps. He turned towards the door, his hand hovering over the latch. Fix the leak, or I swear to you, the next report you receive will be blank. He opened the door and stepped out into the corridor, the smell of carbolic acid lingering in his wake, a ghostly trail that marked his passage. The door clicked shut, leaving Reed alone once more with the stack of lies on his desk and the red letter hidden beneath them. Reed looked down at the newspaper. The headline seemed to mock him, the bold letters dancing in the flickering gaslight. He picked up the paper, crumpling it slowly in his fist, the wet ink staining his palm, a dark mark that would not wash off easily. He walked to the fireplace, where the embers of the morning's fire still glowed with a dull, sullen heat. He threw the crumpled ball of paper onto the grate. It caught instantly, the edges curling black as the flames licked upward, consuming the words, the details, the violation of the dead. But the knowledge remained. The leak was real, and somewhere in the station, a man was selling secrets for the price of a pint, unaware that he was feeding a beast that would eventually consume them all. Reed turned back to the desk, his hand reaching for the drawer where the revolver lay, cold and heavy against his palm. The hunt had changed. They were no longer just looking for a killer in the streets. They were looking for a traitor in the ranks. The latch gave. Iron shrieked against rusted wood, a sound that scraped the inside of Phillips's ear canal, sharp and sudden in the grey damp of the courtyard. He pushed. The door to number 13 Miller's Court swung inward on a hinge that groaned like a dying thing, revealing a darkness so thick it seemed to have weight, pressing out against the weak morning light. Smell hit him first. Not the stale beer and coal smoke that usually choked these rookeries, nor the familiar, cloying sweetness of decay he had learned to tolerate over the last 10 weeks. This was different, heavy, wet, a coppery tang so dense it coated the back of his throat, mixing with the sour reek of voided bowels and something else, something sweet and rotting that reminded him of meat left too long in a butcher's window during a heat wave, only colder, sharper, intimate. Constable Bowyer stood by the window, his back to the room, shoulders heaving. The young man's hand clamped over his mouth, fingers white-knuckled against his own skin. He turned as Phillips entered, eyes wide, the pupils blown black with a terror no amount of drill could suppress. Dr. Bowyer choked, the word barely forming. He stumbled sideways, boot heel catching on the uneven floorboards, and lurched towards the doorway. God help us, I can't, the air. Steady, man, Phillips said. His voice sounded flat, stripped of emotion, a clinical instrument he forced into operation despite the revolt churning in his gut. Step outside, breathe, do not vomit in here. Bowyer nodded, a frantic jerking motion, and scrambled past him into the courtyard, gasping as if surfacing from deep water. The fresh air did little to cleanse the palate. The odor clung to the clothes, the hair, the very pores of the skin. Phillips took a breath through his mouth, shallow and controlled, and stepped further into the room. Shadows pooled in the corners, distorted by the single pane of glass that offered the only view of the court. Dawn was breaking, a sickly grey wash that failed to penetrate the gloom, leaving the center of the room obscured. Phillips reached into his bag, fingers closing around the cold metal of his lancet case, then withdrew a box of lucifers. He struck one. The flare of sulfur bloomed bright and harsh, casting jumping, monstrous shapes against the peeling wallpaper. He held the flame to the stub of a tallow candle sitting on the mantelpiece. Wax dripped, hardening instantly on the wood. The light grew, trembling, pushing back the dark just enough to reveal the bed. Or what remained of it. Phillips stopped. His hand froze, the match burning down to singe his fingertips before he dropped it to the floor and crushed it under his boot. Blood. It was not merely pooled. It had been splashed, sprayed, wiped, and arranged. The white sheets were gone, swallowed by a deluge of crimson that had soaked through the mattress and dripped onto the floorboards in thick, coagulating rivulets. The pattern was wrong, chaotic. Yet within the chaos, there was a terrible order, a deliberate placement of flesh that defied the hurried slashing of a street corner attack. Mary, he whispered. The name felt inadequate, a fragile thing against the carnage before him. He moved closer, boots sticking slightly to the floor where the fluid had not yet set. The body lay in the center of the bed, but it was difficult to distinguish the woman from the wreckage. The head was pulled back, the face obscured by a mask of tissue that had been stripped away with surgical or perhaps butcherly precision. The throat was cut, yes, the familiar deep gash extending from ear to ear, but that was merely the beginning. The abdomen was laid open, a vast, hollowed cavity where organs should have been. They were not inside her. Phillips leaned in, the candlelight flickering across the exposed ribcage. The heart was missing, the liver gone, the kidneys taken, in their place a hollow space, cleaned out with a thoroughness that suggested hours, not minutes. And around the room, on the table, on the chair, Even perched on the mantelpiece beside the candle lay the missing parts, arranged, displayed. A kidney sat on a plate near the washstand, pale and waxy in the gloom. A section of bowel draped over the footboard like a garland. The face, or what was left of it, had been hacked beyond recognition, the features obliterated as if the killer sought to erase her identity entirely, to reduce Mary Jane Kelly to nothing but meat and bone. Phillips felt his stomach contract, a violent spasm that forced him to grip the edge of the table for support. He closed his eyes for a second, counting the beats of his own heart, forcing the surgeon back into the driver's seat, burying the man who wanted to run, to vomit, to scream. He opened his eyes. He had to look. He had to see. "Right," he said aloud, the word hanging in the stagnant air. "Begin." He reached for his notebook, the paper stiff in his cold hands. He uncapped his pen. The ink flowed black and permanent. November 9th, 1888, 10:45 a.m., body discovered in room 13, Miller's Court, Spitalfields. He wrote the time. He wrote the location. He stopped, the pen hovering over the page as he looked at the arrangement of the flesh on the table. It was not just butchery, it was a performance. A message written in anatomy that he was expected to read, to decipher, to validate. A floorboard creaked behind him. Phillips spun, candle flaring, casting long, dancing shadows against the wall. Inspector Aberline stood in the doorway, hat in hand, face pale as parchment. He did not step inside. He could not. The smell had already reached him, curling around his frame like a visible mist. "George," Aberline said, his voice trembling, stripped of its usual authority. Is it her?" Phillips looked back at the bed, at the hollowed chest and the arranged organs, at the terrible silence of the woman who would never speak again. "It is her," Phillips said, dipping the pen again so the nib scratched loudly against the paper. "And Thomas, you had best bring more candles, for we will be here a long time." Aberline nodded once, a jerky motion, and stepped back into the hall, retreating from the sight, leaving Phillips alone with the dead and the terrible, meticulous work of counting the pieces of a human soul. The candle guttered, smoke rising in a thin, grey thread towards the ceiling, the only movement in a room where time had stopped, frozen by the sheer magnitude of the evil that had occupied this space mere hours before. Phillips touched the edge of the table, his finger coming away sticky. He wiped it on his apron, leaving a fresh red smear against the white linen, a mark that would not wash out, a stain that would seep deeper than the fabric, into the bone, into the memory, forever. He picked up the lancet. The steel gleamed cold in the candlelight. "Let us see," he murmured, and began to cut. The steel bit, cold entry, then the drag of resistance as the blade met tissue that had long since surrendered its warmth. Phillips worked the incision with a rhythm born of 2 decades in the mortuary, a mechanical cadence that kept the horror at bay. Left to right, deep enough to expose, careful not to sever what remained of the structural integrity. He needed to know the order. The sequence was the only truth left in this room. Everything else was theater. Blood welled thick and black, oozing from the cut rather than pumping. It confirmed what the pooling on the floorboards had already whispered. The heart had stopped before the knife began its main work. She had been dead when the dismantling started. A small mercy, perhaps, though the distinction felt thin as onion skin against the scale of the violation. He set the lancet down on the table, the metal clicking against the wood. The sound was absurdly loud. "Time," he muttered. "How much time?" The question hung in the air, unanswered by the dead woman and the arranged organs staring back from the mantelpiece. To remove the heart, the liver, the kidneys, to strip the face and arrange the bowels with such deliberate geometry required more than a few minutes of frenzied slashing. This was not the work of a man fleeing the sound of a constable's whistle. This was a butcher at his block, unhurried, secure in his dominion. Phillips leaned closer, the candle flame dancing in the draught from the broken window pane. He traced the line of the abdominal cavity with his eyes. The muscles had been peeled back, folded with a neatness that contradicted the chaos of the blood spray. Whoever did this knew where to cut to avoid excessive bleeding, or perhaps the blood had simply drained away before the final arrangements were made. The killer had stood here, in this single room, surrounded by the smell of opened viscera and the smoke of his own fire, for hours. Neighbors! The thought struck him with the force of a physical blow. Miller's Court was not a graveyard. It was a warren of living souls, families packed into rooms no larger than this one, separated by walls of lath and plaster so thin a cough carried to the street. How had no one heard the scraping of bone, the wet tear of muscle, the splash of blood into the basin? He looked at the fireplace. The grate held the ashes of a roaring fire, recently stoked. The killer had burned something, clothes, evidence, or had he simply kept the fire going to see his work, to warm his hands while he carved? Impossible, Phillips whispered. The word tasted of ash. He picked up the lancet again. His hand did not shake. It never shook during the work, a betrayal of the body's refusal to acknowledge the mind's screaming. He probed the neck wound, separating the layers of skin to examine the depth of the initial cut. 2 distinct incisions, one shallow, perhaps a test. The second, deep and fatal, severing the carotid and the windpipe in a single, efficient stroke. Then the pause, then the rest. The logic of it was suffocating. A man could not vanish into thin air. He had to enter the court, knock on the door, be admitted. Mary Jane Kelly was known to take men in for the price of a bed or a drink. She would have opened the latch for a familiar face or a man with a coin bright enough to blind her to danger. Once inside, the door was barred. The window was broken, yes, but the shutter was closed. They were alone. Phillips stepped back, wiping his gloved hands on a rag that was already saturated beyond redemption. He needed to map the timeline. If the fire was lit after the murder to burn the clothes, then the killing happened before dawn. If the neighbors heard nothing, the killing happened when the court was loudest, or when the killer knew they would be drunk enough to sleep through the apocalypse. "Talk to me, Mary," he said, his voice low, rough with a fatigue that had nothing to do with the hour. "Who let him in?" The room offered no answer. Only the stillness of the displayed organs, the pale kidney on the plate looking strangely innocent, like a piece of fruit left out for supper. The bowel draped over the footboard swayed slightly as a draught caught it, a grotesque pendulum marking seconds that no longer existed. He moved to the table where the internal organs had been piled. He touched the liver, cold and firm. It had been scrubbed. The killer had washed the blood from the organs before placing them on display. Who washes the meat? A butcher preparing for sale? A surgeon displaying a specimen? Or a man trying to clean his conscience before the act was even finished? The implications coiled around Phillips's throat, tightening. This was not a crime of passion. Passion was messy, hurried, blind. This was calculation. This was a man who believed he had the right to take apart a human being and rearrange the pieces to suit his own dark aesthetic. And he had done it here, in the heart of White-Capel, surrounded by hundreds of people, without a soul raising an alarm. Phillips capped his inkwell. The scratch of the cork against glass jarred his nerves. He wrote in the notebook, the script tight and controlled. Extensive mutilation performed post-mortem. Duration estimated at several hours. No signs of struggle consistent with a prolonged attack, suggesting victim was incapacitated or deceased before major dismemberment commenced. He stopped, the pen hovered. He wanted to write more. He wanted to scream that the police were blind, that the system was a sieve, that a monster was walking the streets with a pocket full of knives and a mind clear of remorse. But he was a surgeon. His job was the body, not the beast. Yet the body told the story of the beast. He looked at the door. Abeline was out there, waiting for a conclusion that could be printed in the papers, something to feed the hungry crowds gathering behind the cordon. They wanted a name. They wanted a face. They wanted the reassurance that this was the work of a madman who could be caught, caged, and hanged. Phillips knew better. Madness implied a loss of control. This was control absolute. "Thomas," he called out, not turning from the table. His voice was steady, betraying none of the tremor in his gut. "Come in, bring the stretcher." Footsteps approached, hesitant, shuffling. Abeline appeared in the doorway again, accompanied by 2 constables whose eyes were fixed firmly on the floorboards, anywhere but the bed. The smell hit them anew, a wave of copper and rot that made the younger constable gag, turning his head to retch into the hallway. "Steady, man," Abeline snapped, though his own color was gray. He looked at Phillips, seeking guidance, seeking permission to breathe. "Is it done, George? Can we move her?" Phillips looked at the bed, the hollow chest, the missing face, the arranged pieces that spoke of hours of uninterrupted intimacy between killer and victim. He thought of the thin walls, the sleeping families, the silence that had swallowed the screams. "Not yet," Phillips said, walking to the window to peer through the broken glass into the courtyard below where the grey dawn had strengthened, revealing wet cobblestones and the huddled figures of the Vigilance Committee members stamping their feet against the cold. They looked small, insignificant. "I need to check the fire again, and the basin." "The fire," Abeline frowned, stepping cautiously over the threshold. "What of it?" "It was stoked," Phillips said, turning back to the room, his eyes hard. "Someone kept the fire burning, someone sat here in the warmth while the rest of the court froze, while the world slept." He gestured to the carnage. "He was not interrupted, Thomas, he was comfortable." Abeline swallowed, the sound audible in the quiet room. "Comfortable." "Yes." Phillips picked up his bag, the weight of it suddenly unbearable, and he realized this meant the man knew he would not be disturbed. It meant he knew this room, or perhaps he knew these people. He moved towards the door, brushing past the inspector. The fabric of his apron brushed against Abeline's coat, leaving a faint, reddish smear on the dark wool. Neither man acknowledged it. "Get her out," Phillips said, his hand on the latch. "And burn the mattress, burn the sheets, burn the floorboards if you can. There is nothing left here but evil." He stepped into the hallway, the air slightly clearer, though the scent of death clung to his clothes, his hair, the very pores of his skin. He walked towards the stairs, his boots heavy on the wood. Behind him, the scraping of the stretcher began, a dull, rhythmic sound that echoed the beating of a heart that was no longer there. Phillips reached the courtyard. The rain had started again, a fine, cold mist that settled on his face like a shroud. He tilted his head back, letting the water wash over him, but it did not cleanse. It only made the cold seep deeper into the marrow, where the images of the room were already taking root, permanent and unshakable. He looked down at his hands. They were clean, scrubbed raw before he left the room, but they looked stained, forever stained. He walked towards the gate, towards the waiting crowds, towards the lies he would have to tell at the inquest. The real story was back in room 13, sitting on a plate, wrapped in silence, and it would never speak. The smell hit him first. Not the copper tang of fresh arterial spray that had stained his cuffs in '88, but the sour, yeasty reek of gin mixed with the damp rot of the railway embankment. Phillips stopped, his boot heel grinding into a patch of wet cinder as he adjusted the collar of his coat against the February chill. Above, the iron girders of the viaduct groaned under the weight of a stationary goods train, the steam hissing down in white plumes that curled around the gas lamp posts like grasping fingers. "Doctor!" Constable Evans stood by the archway, his face pale and slick with rain, holding a lantern that cast a trembling circle of light onto the flagstones. He did not move to greet Phillips, his hand resting on the butt of his truncheon as if the wood offered some shield against the sight at his feet. "Keep the light steady, Evans," Phillips said. He stepped forward, the mud sucking at his boots, and knelt beside the body. Frances Coles lay on her back, her skirts hiked up around her knees, revealing stockings that had slipped down to her ankles. Her throat was a ruin. The cut ran deep, severing the windpipe, but it lacked the clean, sweeping arc of the earlier atrocities. This wound was jagged, hesitant, a sawing motion rather than a surgeon's stroke. Blood had pooled thick and black beneath her neck, soaking into the dirt, but there was no spray on the brickwork behind her. The heart had stopped too quickly, or perhaps the killer had not possessed the strength to drive the blade with the necessary force while the blood still pumped. "Same as the others?" Evans asked. His voice cracked, a boy playing at being a man in a theater of horrors. "The papers will say it's him. They're already gathering at the end of the street." Phillips reached out, his gloved fingers hovering over the woman's face. Her eyes were open, staring up at the soot-stained bricks of the arch, the pupils fixed and dilated. There was no terror frozen in her expression, only a blank, glassy surprise. He touched her cheek. The skin was cool, but not yet stiff. Rigor had not yet claimed the jaw. "The papers will say what they wish," Phillips murmured. He tilted his head, examining the angle of the incision. It started high on the left side of the neck and dragged down to the right, dipping slightly in the middle where the blade had caught on the sternum. Look at the edges, Evans, ragged, multiple strokes. The other cases, the precision was clinical, almost respectful in its brutality. This is butchery born of panic or drunkenness. But the throat, Evans insisted, shifting the lantern closer until the flame sputtered in the draft. Cut from left to right, just like Nichols, just like Chapman. Many throats are cut in Whitecapel, Constable. It is the most efficient way to silence a scream. Phillips withdrew his hand and wiped it on his handkerchief, though the glove remained clean. He looked at the woman's hands. They were clenched into fists, dirt embedded under the fingernails. In the Miller's court case, the killer had taken hours, arranging the organs with a grotesque deliberation that spoke of a mind untethered from humanity. Here there was only haste, a job done badly and abandoned. She was alive when he left her, Evans asked. The question hung in the mist, heavy and unwanted. For a minute, perhaps two. As Phillips stood, his knees popped sharply in the cold air, and he felt the ache settle deep in his lower back, a familiar companion after 2 years of bending over the dead. She fought him. See the bruising on her wrists? He had to hold her down. While the other women were subdued quickly, overpowered with a certainty that suggests practice, this man struggled. A shout echoed from the street beyond the arch, followed by the heavy trample of running boots. Inspector Reed emerged from the gloom, his hat pulled low, his coat dark with rain. He moved with a stiff urgency, his eyes sweeping the scene before locking onto Phillips. "Bagster," Reed said, breathless. He did not offer a greeting, his gaze dropping immediately to the body. "Is it him? Tell me it is him so we can lock the gates and hold the press at bay." Phillips looked at the inspector, seeing the desperation etched into the lines around his mouth. Reed needed this to be the same killer. The department needed a single monster to hunt, a narrative thread to pull that would unravel the mystery and restore order to a district teetering on the edge of riot. To suggest this was a common murder, a drunken dispute turned fatal, would be to admit that the shadow of the Whitecapel murderer still loomed over every cut throat in the East End, real or imagined. "The throat is cut," Phillips said carefully. He watched Reed's shoulders slump, then square again as the inspector grasped at the confirmation he desired. But the manner of it differs, significantly. "Differences can be explained," Reed snapped, waving a hand as if to dispel the medical nuance. "Evolution of method, or a decline. He is tired, doctor. Maybe he is sick. Maybe he is fleeing." "Or maybe it is a copycat," Phillips said. The words felt dangerous in the cold air. "Someone who has read the inquests, someone who knows the signature but lacks the skill to replicate it." Reed stepped closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper as he warned, "Do not say that," insisting it could not be tonight, not until they had a suspect in the cell. He turned to Evans. "Secure the perimeter," he ordered, allowing no one in or out, and demanded a cover for her because the vultures were already circling the lamp posts. Evans hurried away, the lantern swinging wildly to cast long, dancing shadows against the brickwork. Phillips remained standing, looking down at Frances Coles, who was just another name now, soon to be added to the ledger that grew longer with each passing month. Emma Smith, Nichols, Chapman, Stride, Eddowes, Kelly, and now Coles. A procession of women walked into the dark, none returning. He thought of the half-kidney sent to George Lusk, the smell of cheese and decay that had permeated the Vigilance Committee's office. He thought of the letters, the Dear Boss hoax that had sent the police chasing ghosts across 3 counties. All of it amounted to this: a woman dead under a railway arch, her life extinguished by a blade that may or may not have been held by the same hand that had dissected Mary Jane Kelly in a room filled with blood. "Will you come to the mortuary?" Reed asked. He was lighting a cigar, the match flare illuminating his weary eyes for a brief second. "We need the report by morning. The coroner is demanding an inquest within the week." "I will come," Phillips said. He bent down once more, adjusting the hem of Coles's skirt to cover her knees. A small, futile gesture of dignity in a place devoid of it. "But I will write what I see, Edmund. I will not tailor the anatomy to fit your convenience." Reed exhaled a cloud of smoke that mingled with the steam from the train above. "We shall see, Doctor, we shall see." He turned and walked back towards the street, his footsteps echoing on the wet stones. Bring the stretcher, Evans. Move her before the crowd breaks the line. Phillips watched them go, the lantern light receding into the fog. The silence returned, broken only by the drip of water from the girders and the distant rumble of the city waking up to another day of grief. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his notebook, the leather soft and worn from constant use. He flipped to a fresh page, the paper crisp against his thumb. February 13, 1891, under Railway Arch, Swallow Gardens. He paused, the pen hovering over the inkwell. The hand that held it did not tremble, but the weight of the words felt heavier than it had 2 years ago. Then there had been shock, a visceral horror that had shaken him to his core. Now there was only a dull, grinding resignation. The horror had become routine. The exceptional had become mundane. He wrote the time of arrival. He noted the position of the body. He described the wound, choosing his words with surgical precision, avoiding the lurid adjectives that would inevitably find their way into the evening editions. Incision irregular, edges bruised, suggestive of multiple applications of force. A rat scurried across the flagstones near his boot, pausing to sniff at the dried blood before darting back into the shadows. Phillips watched it disappear into a crack in the masonry, life finding a way amidst the death. It was the only law that seemed to hold true in White-Capel. He closed the notebook and tucked it away. The stretcher-bearers were returning, their faces grim, carrying the canvas sheet that would hide France's coals from the world. Phillips stepped back, allowing them to work. He would follow them to the mortuary, wash his hands in carbolic soap until his skin was raw, and write the report that would satisfy the coroner, but perhaps not the truth. As they lifted the body, a coin slipped from the folds of her skirt and clattered onto the stone, spinning briefly before settling heads up. A penny, her entire fortune perhaps. The bearers did not notice. They marched on, their boots splashing in the puddles, carrying the dead woman towards the light of the street. Phillips bent down and picked up the coin. It was warm from her pocket. He turned it over in his fingers, the profile of the queen worn smooth by circulation. He slipped it into his own waistcoat pocket next to his watch, a keepsake, a reminder that for all his science, for all his reports and inquests, he could not save them. He could only count the cost. He turned and followed the stretcher out of the arch, into the grey dawn that was beginning to bleed through the fog. The city waited, hungry and indifferent, ready to swallow the next victim before the sun fully rose. The arrest happened not with a shout, but with the dull thud of a boot against a cellar door 3 streets over. Phillips stood by the mortuary gate, the iron cold enough to bite through his glove, watching as 2 constables dragged a man into the pale light of the gas lamp. The fellow stumbled, his coat torn at the shoulder, revealing a patch of grey flannel that had seen better decades. Thomas Sadler. The name circulated among the officers like a dropped coin, picked up and passed around until the edges were worn smooth by repetition. "Got him in the lodging house on Dorset Street," Evans shouted, his voice cracking with a triumph that felt too bright for the grey morning. "Matches the description, was seen with her Tuesday night." Sadler twisted in their grip, his face a map of exhaustion and confusion, eyes darting towards the surgeon as if seeking a medical reprieve from the legal noose tightening around his neck. He did not scream. He did not protest his innocence with the fervor of a man wrongly accused. He simply hung limp in their hold, a sack of meal waiting to be weighed. "Careful with him," Reed called out, stepping forward to inspect the prisoner with the hungry gaze of a man who has finally found meat after a long famine. "No bruises before the cell, Evans. We need him presentable for the magistrate." "He fought," Evans grunted as he shoved Sadler against the brickwork, the man's head cracking softly against the mortar. "Tried to bolt when we mentioned the knife." Phillips moved closer, drawn by a morbid curiosity that outweighed his professional detachment. He looked at Sadler's hands. They were large, rough, the nails broken and rimmed with the grime of a dockworker or a fireman, not the clean, stained fingers of an anatomist or a butcher. There was no precision in those palms, no steadiness. "Doctor," Reed said, noticing Phillips's scrutiny, "what do you make of him? Does he have the look?" "The look of what, Edmund?" Phillips asked, keeping his tone flat. "A murderer, or a man who drank too much gin and woke up with constables in his face?" Don't play the cynic with me, George, not now. Reed lowered his voice, though Sadler was close enough to hear the rustle of their coats. The press is already sniffing around the yard. If we don't have a name by noon, they'll print that the Ripper is loose again. We need this to stick. Won't stick if the anatomy disagrees, Phillips said. He stepped past Reed, invading the prisoner's personal space until he could smell the stale tobacco and sour sweat radiating from the man's skin. Sadler flinched, pulling his hands back as if expecting a blow. Phillips ignored the fear, focusing instead on the cuticles, the shape of the knuckles. The wound on Francis Coles was jagged, hacked. It lacked the surgical economy of the previous cases. This man. He gestured vaguely at Sadler's trembling limbs. He looks capable of a brawl, perhaps even a clumsy killing in a fit of rage. Then it fits, Reed snapped, seizing the qualification like a lifeline. Clumsy or precise, a throat is a throat. The public doesn't distinguish between a surgeon's scalpel and a doctor's blade when there's blood on the pavement. They want a monster, and they want him in chains. They want a story, Phillips corrected, turning away from the prisoner to face the inspector. And you are eager to give them one, even if the chapters don't align. Sadler muttered something, a slurred plea that died before it formed words. His eyes locked onto Phillips's, wide and wet, begging for a diagnosis that would exonerate him. Tell them I'm sick, the gaze said. Tell them I'm mad. Tell them anything but the truth. Phillips felt a sharp pang in his chest, a sympathetic ache that had nothing to do with muscle or bone. He knew that look. He had seen it in the mirrors of his own mind after Mary Jane Kelly, after Catherine Eddowes. It was the look of a creature trapped in a machine it could not comprehend, destined to be ground down for the sake of order. The city demanded a conclusion. The Home Office demanded a resolution. The newspapers demanded a headline. Truth was a luxury none of them could afford. Take him away, Reed ordered, waving a hand as if dismissing a servant, and commanded that the man be locked in the strong room. No visitors, no paper. I want to question him myself before the superintendents arrive. The constables hauled Sadler forward. The man's boots scraped against the cobbles, a harsh, grating sound that echoed under the archway. He did not look back. There was no point. The machinery had engaged. The gears were turning, crushing whatever nuance lay in the shadows of Swallow Gardens beneath the weight of necessity. Phillips watched them disappear into the gloom of the station entrance, the heavy door clanging shut with a finality that vibrated in the soles of his feet. Silence rushed back in, filling the void they had occupied, but it felt different now, thinner, contaminated. You could have helped, Reed said, lighting another cigar. The flame flickered in the draft, casting long, dancing shadows against the wet bricks. A word about his demeanor, a suggestion of instability, it would have sealed the matter. And perjured my professional opinion? Phillips asked. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the warm penny he had taken from Francis Coles. The metal felt heavy, an anchor dragging him down. I will write that the wounds are consistent with a left-handed attacker using a blunt instrument. I will write that the force was excessive, but I will not write that this is the Whitecapel murderer. The signatures do not match, Edmund. The rhythm is wrong. Rhythm, Reed scoffed, exhaling a plume of blue smoke. You speak of rhythm while women are carved up in the gutters. Does the rhythm matter to the dead, Doctor? Does it bring them back? No, Phillips said, but it prevents us from hanging the wrong man for the right reasons. Reed stared at him, the cigar burning forgotten between his fingers. For a moment, the mask of the administrator slipped, revealing the weary clerk beneath, a man drowning in paperwork and public expectation, desperate for anything that would float. Then the mask slid back into place. Write your report, George, Reed said softly. Write exactly what you see. But know this, by the time the ink is dry, the world will have already decided who did it. Your science is just the footnote. He turned and walked towards the station, his coat tails swishing against his calves, leaving Phillips alone in the yard. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the soot-stained sky above, a bruised purple color that promised more rain before nightfall. Phillips leaned against the cold iron gate, closing his eyes. He could still hear the scrape of Sadler's boots, the clatter of the cell door. He thought of Frances Coles, lying on the slab inside, her throat opened by a hand that might never be found, or might be found in the wrong cell. He thought of the others, the procession of names that stretched back 2 years, each one a demand for justice that the law seemed incapable of delivering. The penny in his pocket pressed against his thigh, a small, hard reminder of the cost. He pulled it out, turning it over in the dim light. Heads or tails, guilty or innocent, it made no difference to the coin. It would spend the same in either case. He shoved it back deep into his waistcoat, buttoning the pocket securely. There was work to do. The report awaited. The coroner demanded his facts, stripped of sentiment and speculation. He would give them the facts. He would give them the jagged edges and the bruised tissue and the lack of surgical skill. Let the world make of it what they would. Pushing off the gate, Phillips walked towards the mortuary door. The handle was cold, slick with condensation. He turned it, the latch clicking loudly in the quiet yard, and stepped inside to wash his hands. The water would be cold. The soap would sting. And when he dried his skin, it would feel raw, as if he had scrubbed away something that could never truly be removed. He approached the desk, where the death certificate lay waiting, the blank lines staring up at him like open wounds. He picked up his pen, the nib gleaming in the gaslight, and dipped it into the inkwell. The dark fluid clung to the metal, thick and viscous. Frances Coles, he wrote. The letters flowed smoothly, a stark contrast to the violence of her end. Cause of death, hemorrhage from division of the throat. He paused, the pen hovering over the date. Outside, a church bell began to toll, the sound muffled by the brickwork, counting out the hours of a day that offered no salvation. He pressed the nib to the paper, signing his name with a steady hand, knowing that while the killing might have paused, the silence that followed was far more terrible than any scream. The gas jet hissed, a thin, serpentine sound that cut through the thick quiet of the study. Phillips rubbed his thumb against the edge of the ledger, the paper rough and dry under his skin. He did not look at the ink. He looked past the bound pages, past the clinical measurements of incision depth and organ displacement, to the women who had existed before the knife ever touched them. It was a rebellion, this private act of reconstruction. The world saw only the carnage, the sensationalized butcher's work that filled the columns of the Star and the Times, reducing complex lives to headlines about horror and fiends. But here, in the flickering amber light, he could restore them. Mary Ann Nichols. He closed his eyes and the mortuary slab dissolved. The smell of carbolic acid vanished, replaced by the scent of cheap lavender water and stale tobacco smoke. He saw her not with her throat severed, but standing in the doorway of a lodging house in Spitalfields, pulling a shawl tight against the morning damp. She was laughing at something a neighbor had said, a quick, bright sound that bounced off the brickwork. She wanted a cup of tea. That was the whole of her ambition in that moment. Not redemption, not a grand escape, just the simple, burning need for warmth in her belly and a dry bed for the night. Her hands were red from scrubbing, her boots worn thin at the heel, but she walked with a purpose that the post-mortem report could never capture. She was a mother who had lost children, a wife who had lost a home, but in this second of memory, she was simply a woman waiting for the kettle to boil. "You were more than the cut," Phillips murmured. His voice sounded strange in the room, too loud against the ticking clock. Annie Chapman followed. The image shifted, sharp and sudden. He saw her in a kitchen, arguing over the price of a potato, her voice sharp with wit, her eyes flashing with a defiance that poverty had failed to extinguish. She spoke of going to the country, of breathing air that did not taste of coal dust and gin. She had plans, small, fragile plans, like a bird building a nest in a storm, but they were hers. The mutilation in Dorset Street had stripped her of dignity, had turned her into a spectacle for the gawping crowds, but here she was whole. She was adjusting her bonnet, smoothing her hair, checking her reflection in a cracked mirror. She cared about how she looked. She cared about being seen as a person, not a pawn in a killer's game. The memory of Elizabeth Stride arrived next, bringing with it the phantom taste of a clay pipe. He pictured her in Dutfield's yard, not bleeding out on the cobbles, but leaning against the wall, taking a long drag of tobacco, watching the shadows lengthen. She was waiting for a man, yes, but also waiting for the night to pass, for the dawn to bring a reprieve from the constant, gnawing fear of the workhouse. She hummed a tune, something Swedish, a lullaby from a childhood in Gothenburg that the streets of London had tried to erase. Her throat was intact. Her voice was clear. She was singing to herself, a private melody that no one else heard, a secret rhythm that kept the despair at bay. "And you, Catherine," Phillips said, the name catching in his throat. Eddowes, the vision was vivid, almost painful in its clarity. He saw her in a cell, perhaps, or a cheap coffee stall, talking fast, her hands moving as she spoke. She was clever. She knew the streets, knew the tricks, knew how to talk her way out of trouble or into a free meal. She wore a man's cap sometimes, a joke, a flourish. She had a laugh that could fill a room, a boisterous, unapologetic sound that dared the world to judge her. She was thinking about her children, about the letters she had written and the promises she had broken, but she was still fighting, still alive. The knife had taken her face, had tried to erase her identity, but in his mind she was whole. She was wiping her mouth with the back of her hand, squinting against the gaslight, demanding another penny for her trouble. The final two women drifted into the line, silent but present. Mary Jane Kelly, young and terrified, dreaming of a wedding dress that would never be worn, standing in Miller's Court and imagining a future where the rain stopped and the sun actually shone on the pavement. Francis Coles, the last one, the final weight on his conscience, walking home in the early morning mist, thinking only of sleep, of the pillow, of the few hours of oblivion before the hunger woke her again. They stood before him, a row of 6, not victims, not evidence, women. Phillips opened his eyes. The room was empty, save for the shadows stretching long across the floorboards. The gas flame dipped again, starving for oxygen, casting the desk into a momentary gloom before flaring back to a sickly yellow. "They are not your wounds," he said again, firmer this time. "They are not the reports." A carriage rattled past on the street outside, the iron rims clattering over the setts, a harsh, rhythmic noise that shook the window pane. The sound was mundane, ordinary. It was the sound of a city that did not care. London continued its endless churn, digesting the morning and spitting out the evening, indifferent to the blood that had soaked into its foundations. Somewhere out there, a newsboy was shouting about a new suspect, a fresh theory, a lie designed to sell papers. Somewhere, a policeman was locking a gate, futilely trying to keep the darkness at bay. Somewhere, a man who had held the knife was lighting a cigar, or counting his change, or kissing a wife goodnight. The realization settled over Phillips, heavy and cold. The killer was not a monster hiding under the bed. He was part of the fabric. He had walked among them, breathed the same air, touched the same railings, and now he was gone, not captured, not judged, just dissolved like sugar in hot tea, leaving no trace but the sweetness of a memory that no one could prove. Science had reached its limit. The microscope could show the fiber, the scalpel could map the wound, but neither could find the man. The mystery was not a puzzle to be solved. It was a hole in the world, a void that swallowed logic and reason and left only fear. Phillips reached out and placed his hand on the leather spine of the nearest volume. The material was cool, smooth, unyielding. It contained the truth, or as much of it as could be captured in ink. It listed the dates, the times, the injuries, the conclusions. It was meticulous, it was accurate, it was utterly insufficient. It recorded the end of the women, but it could not record the life that had been stolen. It could not scream for them, it could not weep. He sat very still, listening to the city breathe. The distant rumble of an omnibus, the shout of a drunkard, the whistle of a factory shift changing. The great beast of London rolled on, uncaring, unstoppable. It had swallowed 6 lives and asked for seconds. The gas lamp flickered violently, the flame shrinking to a blue pinpoint before surging back. It was time. There was nothing more to say, nothing more to write. The verdict would remain unwritten, suspended in the fog that clung to the streets, a permanent stain on the conscience of the age. Phillips took a breath, deep and slow, filling his lungs with the stale air of the study. He looked at the row of ghosts one last time, nodding to each in turn, a silent acknowledgement of their humanity, their dignity, their right to be remembered as more than the sum of their injuries. Then he turned his gaze back to the desk, to the ledger that waited for his final signature. He picked up the pen. The nib hovered over the paper, trembling slightly. "Rest now," he whispered. He pressed the nib down, the ink flowing black and final, sealing the book, sealing the case, sealing the silence. The Butcher's Quill is a work of fiction. Its characters and scenes are invented, but the story is grounded in real events, places, and the social conditions of its period, dramatized, not documented. The history behind it draws on these real sources. Capturing Jack the Ripper Internet Archive. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper Internet Archive. Hong Kong Daily Press, 1888-11-05, Internet Archive. Whitehead Murders. Jack the Ripper. Researched via Wikipedia and contemporary records. Liberties taken with the timeline or with real persons are the author's own.